All right, we're admitting them. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are just waiting a few minutes as people sign on the call. While we wait, I always love to get to know who is tuning in the audience. So if you'd like, you could share your name and the state or region that you're calling in from. Again, that's your name and the state or region that you're calling in from. We'll just wait a couple of minutes as people sign on before we get started. Oh, wow. Coming in quick. Lots of people from California. We've got Larry. Hi, Larry, in New York, Maine, Tennessee. Welcome, everyone. Hi, Jen. All right. Illinois, Maryland, New York. We've got DC, Minnesota. More from California, Arizona. Wow, some great turnout. Welcome, everyone. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. A little bit of everywhere. That's great. All right. So it does look like admissions have slowed a bit. I know we started just a minute late, so I appreciate your patience. I will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Stephanie Wolf, and I am the Membership Relations Coordinator here at Population Connection. I'm so excited to be gathered with so many passionate supporters all across the country for this important discussion on World Population Day. Today, we will hear from our communications team who works diligently to make conversations on population challenges more mainstream. These efforts are led by Marian Starkey, our Vice President for Communications. Marian is also the editor of our quarterly magazine and in her free time volunteers as a clinic escort at Planned Parenthood. We also have Olivia Nater, our communications manager. Olivia writes phenomenal blog posts for our website. She interviews our global partners and is quick to respond to misleading media articles with letters to the editor and opinion editorials. In addition, we have Hannah Evans, our senior analyst. Hannah's work focuses on public speaking and developing academic style resources for professors and college students. She also manages our social media strategy. Now, this is just a snippet of all the work our communications team does, but we will learn more about that during the discussion today. If you have any questions for our speakers, please drop them in the Q&A box that is found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our very best to get those answered during the Q&A session. For any questions we don't have time to answer, we will provide written answers along with a recording of the presentation slides, and access to the chat box discussion. That's all the housekeeping items for me. So I will send it over to you, Marian, Hannah, and Olivia.
All right, thank you so much. Perfect. All right, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's always really great to get together like this and discuss important topics related to our mission and what's been going on in the world. Today, in commemoration of World Population Day, the three of us are going to be discussing the state of the global population, but specifically the topic of low fertility, slowing birth rates, and the US economy. This has been in the news a lot lately, so we thought we'd take this opportunity to explore the topic and to clarify what it means in relation to both the environment and the economy. And my role within this presentation is to first introduce all of this by situating population within the broader context of the environment. I'm hoping to do this as a way to better understand and properly assess what lower fertility actually means for the planet. As we all know and are well aware of, the global population reached 8 billion people this year, which is a truly incredible milestone. And just for reference, I like to give these reference points whenever I talk about this milestone, because I think it's really difficult to like conceptualize how big of a number 8 billion actually is. But if you were to count every second from 1 to 8 billion people, or just to 8 billion as a number, it would take 761 years. Not only that, it took us only 12 years to get from 7 billion people to 8 billion people. This is unprecedented in terms of growth and really portends a lot of challenges for us as we kind of look to the future, environmentally speaking. And at a macro scale, there are two major kind of ideologies surrounding this milestone and the continued growth of the human population. There's like two camps, so to speak. The first camp believes that more growth is better in all ways. It's better for society, it's better for humans, it's better for the environment, it's better for everything, because more people means more creativity, means more innovation, means more opportunity to solve problems. This is a kind of cornucopian perspective that assumes that all problems will ultimately be fixed by human innovation and technology. The other perspective, which is more representative of like a conservative ideology, and that's more one that like environmentalists usually assume, say that, 8 billion people being on the planet is a real problem for us relative to the fact that we live on a finite planet with finite natural resources. So the fact that there's 8 billion of us is something that should be looked at as a challenge and something that we need to learn how to cope with and mitigate in terms of the damage that it's producing relative to things like consumption, to waste production, to crowding, and so on. This perspective also says that slower population growth and slower growth overall in all ways is really necessary for us to achieve as members of a single planet, again, with finite resources. But in terms of the environment and our impact on the planet, there are a few things that we know for sure and can like generally discuss. And the major sort of overarching principle here is that humans have had a really deep and profound impact on the earth and its natural systems, especially in recent years. Some of the major contributors to large-scale environmental degradation include things like agriculture, food production, mining, industrial infrastructure, urban development, all of which is increasing and directly related to population growth. We also know that we as humans have created and are perpetuating the existential challenge of climate change. And we also know that for the first time ever, humans have caused a mass extinction event where a huge amount of species has died off, thereby altering the fabric and functioning of vital ecosystems and changing the environment as we know it. Next slide, please. And to put all of this into perspective, I think it's always useful to look at this graph, which really does a great job of exposing like the drastic changes and imbalances that we're experiencing in terms of population growth. If we look historically, we can see very quickly that one of the major reasons why population growth is of concern has to do with the really rapid rate of growth that has occurred over the past 200 years, especially. It's been explosive, to say the least. Next slide, please. And this means that even small increases in the total growth rate will still result in really big absolute increases in human population. Now we're adding around 80 million people to the planet each year, even though our growth rate is very low and has continued to be low. It's been declining since the 1960s. The growth rate is depicted in the purple line on this graph. Next slide, please. And in terms of population, the environment, and development, it's necessary to note that population growth is really directly related to the level of development within countries and societies. In that the places with the highest fertility rates and the fastest growth rates are the least developed and have the lowest environmental outputs. They're also the most vulnerable to climate change, despite being the populations that are contributing the least to the problem. Conversely, the most developed regions have the lowest population growth rates, but the highest environmental footprints. And this means many things. A few things I'm going to highlight here. One, population growth needs to be understood within the broader spheres of things like resource use, consumption patterns, access to resources, affluence, and so on. The United States, for example, represents 5% of the global population, but consumes over 20% of the Earth's resources. And this also means that as societies develop and increase in affluence, the demand for natural resources and the production of waste will also increase. Right now, 80% of the global population resides in what's called a middle income country that's rapidly industrializing. So this means that 80% of humans on Earth, or about 5.8 billion people, live in countries that are increasing in affluence. That's going to mean increases in demand for resources, increases in demand for food, increases in demand for things like ruminant meat, which have a really high ecological footprint, and so on. This is representative of a really complicated challenge. To me, I think that this is another very clear sign that we need to be changing the way that we're producing food and energy, and we need to shift our economic structures away from incentivizing endless growth and consumption. This is not like an individual problem. This is no one's fault. It's the indication of a failing system that needs restructuring. Next slide, please. In terms of climate change, we also, again, know that undoubtedly human influence is contributing to temperature increases that we're seeing play out that are causing all of these large-scale ecological issues and changes in our weather and our landscapes, right? This is a few graphs that was taken from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And again, finally, this organization and all others really are coming out and saying that undoubtedly and with broad consensus that humans are contributing to climate change via CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. These organizations are constantly warning us, right, that unless we make drastic cuts to emissions on a global scale, things are just going to continue to get worse. This is something that, again, we need to contend with, and we need to kind of situate population within this problem. Next slide, please. And I want to present these next slides as and the synergies between them as a way to kind of more broadly, historically contextualize all of this, and to say that this is all happened within the span of the past 300 years or so, excuse me, and has started because of the Industrial Revolution, which allowed death rates to fall really drastically and shifted our production practices, our energy sources, and our consumption patterns. The Industrial Revolution was a really amazing period of time because it fundamentally changed everything and set the basis for really widespread and dramatic increases in things like standard of living, overall health, and lifespan, all really amazing things from social perspectives. But also, and at the same time, it really set the basis for an increasingly globalized world economy based on fossil fuels, which has put really intense pressure on the environment and created climate change. The Industrial Revolution marked a period of time where death rates fell significantly and population grew rapidly. Next slide, please. This is the same point in time where that's marked by a dramatic rise in global CO2 emissions. Next slide, please, which is the same point in time that marks really drastic increases in average temperature. Next slide. And in this way, it's really important to understand that the relationship between population growth and the environment is intimately related to broader social, political, and economic systems in which we all live. This means, of course, that population growth is a problem, but it's also part of a bigger problem, which is the fact that we are existing in an economic system devoid of any respect for the natural world, or the fact that we depend on it for survival. And even beyond that, I hope that we can look at the synergies presented in the graphs here as a way to realize and remember that these huge existential problems that we're facing have been caused by a particular way of doing things that materialized just 300 years ago. I think we're all really deep into the weeds here now with a really heavily globalized world market, with like widespread and kind of like really pervasive technological influence, which with fossil fuel dependence and reliance. We're all really used to all of this. It's kind of all we know, right? But I think it's really useful for us sometimes to zoom out a little and to see that really all of this is representative of a blink of an eye relative to human history. It has not always been like this, and it doesn't have to stay this way. I think mainstream economists and politicians often try to scare us into thinking that we're going to like lose out somehow by changing the way that we're doing things. But the fact is that things have mostly not been the way that they are now. Globalization really only started in the 80s. And from my point of view, it makes sense that all of this evolved this way. I don't think it was like maliciously intended or anything, but I think we're at a point in time now where we can look at and kind of establish and determine that, you know, this is a system that is not working, so we can change it. And we should encourage that change, even if we don't know all of the answers yet. Next slide, please. And finally, another really important aspect of the discussion we're having around population and the environment is that of species extinction, which is largely a product of habitat destruction, which of course is obviously and directly involved with and related to population growth. A mass extinction event is a short period of geological time in which a high percentage of biodiversity or distinct species like bacteria, for example, or fungi, plants, mammals, birds, or so on, that dies out. Importantly, this needs to be understood within the context of geological time, which is measured over the course of thousands of years. But that said, consider the fact that over the past 50 years alone, the abundance of global wildlife has collapsed by almost 70%. This is a huge deal and really concerning for many reasons, but one of the most fundamental is that all species on Earth exist and interact as part of an interconnected and interdependent web of life called an ecosystem, upon which all life depends. So when a species dies out, there's a ripple effect throughout the entire ecosystem, which disrupts food chains and threatens the vitality of other species and the ecosystem overall. So the fact that biologists have concluded that so many species have died out in such a short period of time is really alarming, certainly impacting and will continue to impact our global ecosystems and the environments upon which we all depend for survival. There have been 5 naturally occurring mass extinction events throughout history, and the most recent occurred 65.5 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs. Now experts believe that we're in another such episode, except this time it's caused by human activity. And on that really positive note, I will turn it over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So as Hannah mentioned, our global population is very much still growing. But as you saw in that one of the graphs she showed, the population growth rate is declining. So that means our population isn't growing as fast as it used to. And that means that our population is getting older. And this is mostly happening in high income countries where birth rates are relatively low. So population aging just means, so this happens when the proportion of older people in a population increases as a result of increasing longevity and decreasing birth rates. And this is usually a positive thing because it means that people are living longer, people are staying healthier, and there is lower infant mortality. And it also means that people have the power to choose smaller families. So yeah, the result is an increase in the average age of a population. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you how the global fertility rate has declined since 1950. It's more than halved. So it stands at around 2.3 live births per woman today, and it's still declining. So the UN actually estimates that it'll probably reach the replacement level of 2.1 in 2055 based on current projections. Next slide, please. So populations are aging and people are having fewer babies, and economists, the media, and some influencers like Elon Musk paint this as a huge disaster. It's a crisis. There's a global baby bust, a demographic crisis. Elon Musk went as far as claiming that population collapse due to low birth rates is a bigger risk to civilization than global warming. And this guy has like millions of followers. So people listen to this and, you know, they start worrying. They think, oh, people choosing small families, that's a bad thing. Next slide, please. So just to put this into context, So out of the 237 countries that are recognized by the UN, so this includes islands and territories, just over half are now at or below replacement level fertility, which means that in the absence of migration, the population would eventually stop growing. Some countries have already stopped growing. So the oldest countries currently are Monaco, which has more than a third of its population is over the age of 65. Japan is a really well-known example that's often in the media. Then there's also Italy, Finland, Greece, and Portugal, which you don't hear about very often, but they're also quite old. And yeah, so in response to this, the governments are trying to increase births because they're worried about their population getting older. They're worried about fewer workers, fewer taxpayers, fewer consumers, and slower economic growth. So the portion of governments implementing pronatalist policies, so these are policies that aim to increase births, those increased from around 9% of countries in 1976 to 28% in 2019, according to UN data. So you can see that governments are worried about this. Next slide, please. So this is just a ranking of the top 10 countries ranked according to how many family-friendly policies they have. So these are policies that make things easier for parents, so make it easier for people to have kids. So there are things like extended parental care, subsidized daycare, tax breaks for larger families, things like that. So mostly things that basically, you know, benefit people, they improve lives. But as you can see, these countries' fertility rates are still relatively low. So these policies, even though they might improve lives, they actually have very little effect on the fertility rate. So the highest fertility rate in this list is France, which actually has the highest fertility rate in Europe at just under 1.8. Next slide, please. Oh, and then it's probably worth mentioning South Korea, because South Korea is often in the media because of its incredibly low fertility. So currently it stands at only 0.78 births per woman. And this is in spite of the fact that the government has spent more than 200 billion US dollars on trying to increase births over the past 16 years. But the fertility rate just keeps plummeting. It's still going down. Next slide, please. And there's like something more complicated about Korea. So I recommend this article in the New York Times, which kind of dives into the potential reasons for why. Basically, the best way to find out why women are choosing to have fewer or no kids is to ask them. And so based on surveys of Korean women, they reveal that basically it's deeply entrenched gender inequality and patriarchal customs that are deterring many women in South Korea from having kids. So essentially women are still expected to bear the brunt of childcare duties, and they feel unable to have both a career and a family. So that's kind of what's happening there. And ironically, even though the South Korean president has spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on trying to boost births, he's also actively trying to dismantle feminism. So he's actually banned the term gender inequality from school textbooks, and even canceled funding for some anti-sexism programs. So yeah, it's not getting him what he wants, clearly. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, low fertility rates are very much here to stay. They're a positive thing that result from women's emancipation. So when women are free to use family planning and to have an education and career, they generally choose small families. That just becomes the social norm. And while pro-family policies could have a modest effect in countries with very low birth rates, they're unlikely to achieve the baby boom that many governments want to see. So in countries like South Korea, I'm sure they could increase their fertility rate a little bit if they were to actually tackle the underlying root cause of this issue, so the kind of systemic inequality. And if you make, if you make childcare more affordable, if you make it more affordable for people to have kids, then they might have more kids. But people aren't going to suddenly choose to have 4 kids, when the country has had a low fertility rate for decades. So in conclusion, basically, we need to stop fighting low fertility because it's not a bad thing. And even though it can create some economic challenges, these are things that we can mitigate or adapt to. And that's what Marianne is going to talk about next. Over to you, Marianne.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Yes, as Olivia mentioned, we're going to be now talking about some of the potential mitigating solutions to population aging, specifically in the United States. And before I start, I do want to make very clear that these are not policy prescriptions that come from us. We don't have any official stances on any of what I'm about to present because we're a population organization, not an economic policy organization. And most of what is in these following slides comes from the work of 2 different economists who are talking about exactly what we're talking about, which is that there are solutions to these economic challenges that can get us through this period of time when so many baby boomers are retiring. And the names of those economists are David Bloom, who's at Harvard, and we've done some work with him in the past, and Dean Baker, who is at I wrote it down, where does he work? The Center for Economic and Policy Research. So again, these are not official population connection policy stances. So I do want to show what the dependency ratio has been, is now, and is projected to become in the future. If you've read any of these articles that we've been discussing so far today about the aging crisis in the United States, you'll certainly be reading about the dependency ratio. What they typically don't tell you is that the dependency ratio that they're talking about is only the elderly dependency ratio. So the ratio of people who are 65 and older to the ratio of people who are of typical working age, which varies depending on who's collecting or presenting the data, but typically it's 20 years old until 64 years old. The total dependency ratio, however, includes youth dependence, which of course, is a huge share of the population as well that is not economically productive. So if you look at this graph of total dependency ratio, you see that right now, this is us right now at 71%. We're just about where we were when the data started being collected in 1950. It peaked at 94% in 1965, right at the tail end of the baby boom. And the reason it peaked then is because of the youth dependency ratio, so many young people being born. And looking out to the end of the century, you can see that it goes up to 90%, which of course is a big increase from where we are today, but it's only a slight increase over where we were at that peak. So just to show that, we're heading in a direction that is going to make it necessary to make some changes to some of our economic systems, but it's not uncharted territory. We've been here before. So some of the things that are discussed in terms of making it easier for economies to adapt to aging are getting more people into the workforce who have typically either been left out or pushed out. And so women, of course, are one of those populations. As Olivia was just discussing, it can be pretty difficult for women to have a full-time job while they're raising especially young children. And you can see that over the last 70 years, women's labor force participation has risen at the same time that total fertility in the United States has fallen. Of course, having smaller families, having fewer children, or having no children at all makes it a lot easier for women to join the workforce and stay in the workforce and to work full time, work more hours per week. And so, it's possible that this percentage could rise higher than where it is today. Another place is welcoming people who have a disability into the workforce. Currently, about 10% of people living with a disability consider themselves to be unemployed, meaning that they would work or they would like to work. And that's about twice the percentage of people who are unemployed without a disability. So just, increasing workplace accommodations, allowing people to work remotely, and other things that make it easier for people to either join or remain in the workforce. And that, that includes people who develop a disability as they grow older. Okay. Again, not policy prescriptions that we're presenting here, just presenting information. Immigration obviously is one of the solutions that a lot of people have presented, including, in some of these problematic media articles. Immigrants tend to be working age people who are moving for the purpose of, having higher income at their destination than they have in their place of birth. So they tend to be of working age, or children who obviously grow into people who are of working age. So they can kind of backfill population's workforce as it ages out. I just think this is an interesting thing to point out, we're a global population organization, so this is the type of thing that we look at. Immigrants tend to have higher fertility rates than native born people, but they tend to assimilate their fertility rates to the population of the people that they have joined pretty quickly, which, of course, acts as a way to reduce overall global fertility. So just an interesting thing to note. And then another way to, sort of offset the reduction of the increase of the dependency ratio is to increase the productivity of the people that are in the workforce. So, increasing the investment that we make in human capital. So that's education, skills training, healthcare, preventive healthcare, making it easier for people to work if they want to work. This includes mental health, of course. There are a lot of reasons that people either can't join or stay in the workforce, and addressing some of these issues would make those things easier for people. And this is sort of a wild card. I forget which one of the two economists that I mentioned earlier talked about this, but just, it could, workforce automation could go, different ways. It could displace workers or suppress their wages, because it can obviously be done less expensively with machines, or it could allow people to stay in the workforce longer, because some of the manual labor involved in certain jobs would be lifted from their plate, and they wouldn't have to worry about that aspect of their jobs. So, and it could obviously go both ways as well. And just, a note about involuntary retirement. There's currently a pretty high rate of involuntary retirement in the United States. So I'm not sure how visible these percentages are to people looking on their screens, but for people over the age of 65 in the United States, it's almost half of people feel like they retired earlier than they would have liked to have done. And those percentages are even higher for people in the decade preceding traditional retirement age of 65. So again, making it easier for people to remain in the workforce if that's what they want to do. And there are also incentives for, early retirement, and, they can be a pretty difficult incentive, it can be difficult to pass up an incentive like that, but that could be reconsidered as well. And then just in terms of the time people spend in retirement now, or in their retirement years, I should say, has increased by about 6 years, COVID notwithstanding. You see that drop there. But the number of years that people can expect to continue to live once they reach the age of 65 has increased from 14 years to about 20 years. At the same time, the traditional full retirement age in the United States has only risen by 2 years, from 65 to 67. And the early retirement age has stayed the same at 62 the entire time since Social Security was introduced in 1935. So again, not suggesting that we do anything in particular about it, but just sharing information here. So, I'm sure everybody on this call knows Social Security and Medicare, they're both set up as trust funds, like a pay-as-you-go system, meaning that today's workers are paying the benefits of today's retirees. And both of these entitlement programs are projected to run out of money in the early 2030s. And this is one of economists' biggest concerns. There are some potential solutions floating around that are not politically popular for addressing that and pushing back or eliminating this future insolvency that is projected. Currently the tax on earnings is 6.2%, but that only goes up to the maximum taxable amount, which as of 2023 is $160,000, meaning that any income over that amount is not taxed by Social Security. So I have seen, I want to say it's Bernie Sanders has a policy, a bill that he's introduced where that would remain the same, but that in addition to that, all income above $250,000 would also be taxed. So you get this kind of window in between, but other proposals I've seen are to tax business and investment income, or to tax Social Security benefits like earnings at a higher rate once people are drawing from the system. I think right now it's 85%, bringing it up to 90%. All things that I have read other people have suggested. And then I guess that's it. I guess that's where we wanted to end the formal presentation part of today, but we wanted to leave some time for questions, and I'm glad we were able to do that. So I know we have some pre-submitted questions that I think Stephanie is going to ask. And then it looks like we've got a couple of questions that have been asked in the Q&A as well. So.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thank you so much all for a great presentation. I hope our audience found this just as informative as I did. It was great you set the stage by reviewing those interconnections of population growth and the environment. Marian and Olivia did a wonderful job examining fertility rates, the aging population, and what this might mean for the US economy. As you mentioned, Marian, yes, we do have a few pre-submitted questions that I will start off with. So first up, a couple of years ago, you published an article stating world population gained over 200,000 people per day, or 85 million per year. This was astounding to the people I spoke with. Why have you not promoted this fact more? People do not believe me.
I think Olivia was planning on answering this one.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so we do actually talk about this a lot. We often talk about the fact that our population is still growing and by how much it's still growing, because many people don't realize that our population is still growing. And that's in part due to the many misleading media headlines about baby busts and a population collapse due to low birth rates. So basically, whenever we write a letter to the editor, or when we write op-eds for external media, we point out that the global population is very much still growing, and by how much it's still growing. It's actually around 70 million now per year, based on the past 2 years and what the UN projects for the next couple of years. But yeah, it's a huge number. And yeah, if people don't believe you when you tell them, I would refer them to the UN data. I mean, maybe like if they see the data directly on the UN website, they're more likely to believe it.
I'll share that link in a second.
Perfect.
They can explore the data to their heart's content. There are downloadable spreadsheets. There's an online interactive module where you can, put the countries and the data points that you're interested in, and you can spend a long time on there. So.
Thank you. And sticking to the numbers, another pre-submitted question, they ask, how much reduction in the world's human population is necessary for the stabilization of the environment and reversing the human-caused extinction of all other species?
Anna, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I wish that we knew the answer to that because it would really help streamline things. But the truth is, we can't really know the answer to it just because there's such a wide variation in understanding ecological footprints. They're really relative to the ways in which we use resources and consume. These are things that are not linear across the board and vary really widely. And they create a lot of kind of complications. There's a lot of research that's constantly being done by scientists who are trying to assess the carrying capacity of the Earth, or the maximum amount of people that can sustainably live on the planet within our means as a planet, relative to like resources and the planet's ability to regenerate. But the research is inconclusive, and that's again just because people use resources so differently. If everybody, lived like the average middle class American, we would need several planets to support that type of consumption into the future. And if everybody was like able to, increase their standard of living to, a really like a better extent, then we'd have to kind of reassess things as well. I think ultimately one thing that we really know is that we really need to change the way that we're producing food and energy. We cannot continue to rely on fossil fuels. We cannot continue to have an economy that is structured around growth and that views growth through consumption, and that looks at the economy in terms of linear growth rather than it being regenerative. These are fundamental flaws within our economy that are producing a lot of ecological imbalance and imbalance in all ways. So I think that's more than understanding exactly how many people can live on the planet. I think it's more a question of like, how can we change our systems so that our existence and our continued existence is not in direct conflict with the vitality of our ecological systems.
There is a book, a lot of you probably know about it. It's old. It was written in 1994 called How Many People Can the Earth Support, by Joel Cohen. And the entire book is asking this question and, presenting research from different people and agencies, and he concluded that there's no number. So, and nobody's really attempted seriously to, nail down a number since then, to my knowledge. So, or in any way that's been like widely accepted, I should say. I think we might have lost Stephanie.
Yeah, we lost Stephanie.
I actually do have the questions in front of me though. Okay. So I'll just ask them of ourselves. Let's see. Okay. So there were a couple of questions about birth control, and just, the answer to this one is birth control. So the human species is destroying our planet and we must control birth rates, but how? And of course, if you follow our work, that we, present a human rights-based family planning solution. So we're looking to increase the ability of people in the United States, but mostly around the world, to choose the number of children that they'd like to have, and to be empowered and educated, and have access to use the family planning methods that are right for them. So that is how. That's the how. And there are currently the estimate for the number of people, women in the developing world who have an unmet need for family planning is 218 million. So that's 218 million women who would use family planning or would like to prevent a pregnancy. It's like a 15-part question that actually comes out with that number. But basically, it's people who don't want to get pregnant within the next 2 years, but aren't using birth control. So, talk about there being like low-hanging fruit. It's like you don't even have to change anybody's mind about family size. You just have to get family planning into the hands of the women who would already like to be using it. And then how do we deal with challenges to discussing birth control and family planning? We weren't sure if this person was asking about a US context or an international context, but we thought we'd answer assuming that it's the latter. You know, as you probably know, we work with 19 global partners now that are based around the world in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia. And the way that those organizations work is by having people in the community who are from that community speak the local language, talk to their community members about, you know, norms around family planning, family size, contraception, trying to make it more of an accepted practice. And they have really great success. You know, if you find out that your next door neighbor is using an IUD and they aren't having terrible side effects, then you might be more inclined yourself to get an IUD, for example. So, you know, I think that's the key, though, is having people from within communities do that outreach rather than having, you know, Americans do the outreach to communities like through a translator. That's not ideal. So that's how we would answer that question, I think, in an international context. Next one is about, okay, how will the restrictions on abortion in the US affect the efforts of population connection to lower the birth rate here? And this one is tricky because the data isn't out yet. Like the last data that we've seen for abortion rates and numbers in the United States is from 2020, which of course is from before Roe v. Wade was overturned. What we did see is that during the Trump administration, abortion went up, you know, and I think we can assume that that's because access to family planning was made a lot more difficult because of the domestic gag rule and other, you know, restrictive, regressive policies. But I am going to just share a couple of links in the chat if anybody wants to read into this a little bit more. So there's Guttmacher Institute data, and they collect their data a little bit differently than the CDC does. So this Pew article describes the difference between them and sort of outlines the change over the last, whatever it's been now, 50 years, I guess, since Roe v. Wade went into place. But, you know, the peak at the peak in 1990, there were 1.6 million abortions happening per year, and the rate has been steadily declining since then. That's according to the Guttmacher data. The rate's been steadily declining since then, and it's now spiked a little bit, like I said, well, the data is from the Trump administration years. But, you know, 930,000 is where we were at the last time that they collected data on this. So, you know, as long-acting contraception becomes more available and more widely used, and, you know, as fewer teenagers engage in sexual activity, which has also been on the decline for several decades now, there's less of a need for abortion because there are fewer unplanned pregnancies, despite what Trump would have had us believe during his administration. I don't know if anybody else on the panel wants to say anything about any of those last couple of questions, but oh, okay. And then the last one that was submitted beforehand is, what relationship has been found between global population growth rate, family size, population density, and economic inequality within and between nations? Do you want to talk about this, Olivia? And I'll share the link that we looked at.
Sure. So yeah, so this person was asking about economic inequality as measured by the Gini index, which is just a way of measuring income inequality within a country. So we looked at the rankings of countries according to the Gini index, and there's actually no straightforward correlation between the degree of income inequality of countries and their population growth rate. So that means that the countries with the most unequal wealth distribution don't necessarily have the highest population growth rate. So I think like the most unequal country in the world is South Africa. And then there's a few other African countries, then there's quite a few Latin American countries. The United States is not too far down that list, because as we all know, there's a lot of income inequality in this country. So the more kind of straightforward correlation is actually between poverty and fertility. So countries with high poverty rates also tend to have high fertility rates and rapid population growth as a result. This is what Hannah was showing in her chart earlier. So this is because high poverty is usually also associated with low access to education, low access to family planning, and high gender inequality. So there's definitely that relationship that's more straightforward than economic inequality.
Mm-hmm. Hannah, I wonder if you'd like to tackle this first question in the Q&A, just because I know that you're a big fan of donut economics comes to mind. Question, one solution several countries have taken is to replace gross domestic product with meaningful domestic product. And I can't say that I'm familiar with that term in particular, but I don't know, maybe you are, but if you're not, maybe just talk about some of the alternatives to GDP that others are considering.
Yeah, that's a good, I was noticing that, and it's something that I want to research more because I don't know much about it. So thank you for introducing this concept. Yeah, I think that generally whenever we're talking about population and lower fertility and our relationship with the environment, it's very clear that we need to restructure our economic systems. Again, as I was saying before, in a way that isn't in direct contrast with the health of the environment. Right now, we've got an economic system, that is linear. So it depends on endless growth, and we view growth through consumption. And a linear model actually produces waste at the end of a production cycle, right? That is just an inherent flaw, right? It's not to say that, things haven't been wildly successful or that we can't understand why things have evolved in the way that they have, but that represents something that in the wake of these like existential environmental threats we're facing needs to change. And we can't make it also so that the development of human beings, increases in standards of living, better health, better lifespans, and so on, necessarily also means the degradation of the environments. We need to kind of create regenerative systems that are allow for human beings to live more in accord with rather than in opposition to the environment. I'm not sure about the GDP measurement that you referenced, but there are a few different theories that are being put forth and kind of experimented with. One of which is called donut economics, which is a regenerative circular model that kind of reshapes and recenters the economic system to be one that is regenerative, that doesn't necessarily produce waste, that isn't linear, that isn't dependent on endless growth through the industrialization of things or the consumption of goods. But I think that this is something we don't know the answer to as humans. This is something that we're all exploring. We're at the point now where we need to make decisions about how to create better systems, but the floor is pretty open. So it's kind of it's a scary time, but it's also a really exciting time because there's a lot of opportunities for us to kind of think about, collaborate, and kind of envision for the future. Yes.
Great. Olivia, I think the next one is perfect for you. Are there any one-liners we can use to counteract Elon Musk's misinformed statements? You've spent so much time writing op-eds and letters to the editor about this very topic.
Yeah, we've written letters to Elon Musk directly. We don't think that he read them, but he just won't shut up about this thing. Like he's very concerned about people choosing to have small families. I should add, he himself is a father of 9, I believe, possibly and counting. One-liners, I would say that can be whatever you want to say to him. I mean, like for me personally, I'm always amazed at how someone can be considered so smart, yet can say such stupid things. Yeah, for me, it was really kind of like a reality check, because I realized that he's not actually as smart as people make him out to be, or like he makes himself out to be. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's much point in getting into Twitter fights with Elon Musk. Like, I mean, you could try, like some people do respond to him on Twitter. He is very active on Twitter. But like he tends to only reply to the people that he agrees with. And yeah, like I said, we've responded to him multiple times. We've never received a reply. So I think like the most effective thing to do is just to counter his misinformation, to put the truth out there, to tell people that actually global population is very much slow growing. We're heading for over 10 billion in the second half of the century. There is no baby bust crisis. And yeah, and just pointing people to the actual data, I think, is probably the best way to counter this sort of misinformation. But like in terms of what you want to say to him personally, I think you can be as creative as you want to be, like say whatever you want to say.
I just shared the letter that you wrote to him back in September and published as a blog post on our website, so people can get your take there. Well, it's 2:58. I don't know. Do we have time for one more? What's a quick and easy one to answer? Oh boy. I don't know. Are you guys scanning through these two? What can we answer in 1 minute? Okay, how about one about, here we go. One from Dane came in about South Korea. Gender inequality in South Korea decreases the fertility rate. I thought gender inequality in general causes high fertility. What am I missing? Right, I see what you're saying. I don't know, Olivia, do you have thoughts on that, or should I bumble through an answer?
Sorry, what was the question again?
So it's the last one in this list.
Yeah,
gender inequality in South Korea decreases the fertility rate. I thought gender inequality in general causes high fertility. What am I missing?
Right. Yeah, South Korea is a really interesting case study, because it shows basically that it can go both ways. So extreme gender inequality, if that is manifested in women don't have access to education, women don't have access to contraception, they have to stay at home and are expected to raise many children, then of course it will result in very high fertility. If on the other hand, you're talking about a high income country like South Korea, where women have access to all these things, women go to school, women can use family planning, women can have jobs, then they can make that choice and say, well, I refuse to have kids. I can't have kids because, you know, the system is set against me. They feel like they're being penalized if they make that choice. So yeah, I mean, it shows you that, you know, it can go either way depending on the circumstances of that country. So yeah, I mean, in that case, I think the fertility rate could probably go up just because it's so extremely low. Like the average fertility rate is less than 1 child per woman. I'm sure they could increase that if they were to actually tackle the gender inequality problem.
Mm-hmm. We're at time. Stephanie, I don't know if you wanted to pop back on here and say anything about upcoming events or whatever.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you to the communications team for such an informative presentation and a great Q&A session. We will follow up shortly with a link to this recording, the presentation slides, the chat box discussion, along with all the resources that are linked in the chat box discussion as well. We will share that with you all via email, as well as information about our next upcoming event. So stay tuned, and thank you all again.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Happy World Population Day.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Bye.